order and discipline. Okay, so we have 25 minutes to resolve the Palestinian conflict. We hope that we will manage to do that, and we want to look into the future while also trying to gain as much insight as possible from the past. And we are having this conversation when in the backdrop we have some question marks. Perhaps question mark is an understatement when we ask whether we can even reach an arrangement with the Palestinians or whether we are simply going ahead with a binational state. Are we kind of at a dead end? Shaul, how do you see things? Hello everyone, I am delighted to be here. I think that it is a good time of day to be discussing the Israeli policy. I think that Israel cannot talk about its future if it does not briefly review its past, particularly with the Palestinian Authority. And with your permission, I would like to speak for a few minutes as an introduction for this session about a trauma that happened in Israel between 1992 and 2002 from great hope of an arrangement of a peace process, those secret talks that began in 1992 with the Palestinians, Oslo in 93, and the second part of Oslo in 95. We really thought we were heading for an arrangement, and I think that most of the Israeli public was there, the Israeli leadership, three governments, Rabin's government, Netanyahu's government, and Barak's government made tremendous efforts in order to reach this arrangement. And what happened? I call it this armed conflict of 2002. We, with Palestinians, we had to get the reservists from the IDF and to go into this really harsh campaign, one of the hardest wars that Israel has fought. People ask me, how is it one of the harshest? And I say, because of its outcomes. Between September 2000 and March 2002, Israel lost hundreds of citizens, of civilians, who were murdered, and the ratio was 70-30. 70% of casualties were Israeli citizens, children and adults, and 30% were security forces, and that was intolerable until we went out to Operation Defensive Shield. And now the tables have turned. If in the past most of the Palestinian public supported Arafat when the conflict began in 2000, which the intelligence alerted us to and told us, warned us it was going to happen, but the political echelon did not accept this alert. It was one of the rarest times when, while the IDF prepared, we got to March 2002 with the defense establishment being prepared, and we ended this campaign with two things that are very clear happening. The first is military defeat. Wherever we were, we defeated the terror. And just imagine, just close your eyes and imagine 50,000 troops going into all the teeny tiny alleyways and refugee camps and Palestinian markets in the cities, arresting 8,000 Palestinians, hundreds of terrorists. And we, in fact, shifted the paradigm, the Israeli paradigm. We were no longer in a war of attrition. We were leading to defeat. And this defeat was a victory over the hearts and minds of the Palestinians, particularly their leaders, but also the men on the street, those who supported terror. And I think that nowadays, if we now try to answer this question, these days reality is rather different. Look, the Israeli public, after the second intifada, it wasn't an intifada, it was an armed conflict, and a planned one, planned by Arafat. And after this point in time, the Israeli public did not anymore believe in this process with the Palestinians, and it's carrying on to this day. The public, we used to say, shifted rightwards. It's become more right-wing. And the Palestinian public had a kind of reverse trend. Those who supported terror, 70% of Palestinians had backed Arafat up when he was the ultimate leader of the Palestinians. The entire world backed him up. We were the only ones who dared to say he is choosing terror, and they said, don't say that. when we said, when I say we, I mean the IDF. And now the Palestinians want to have an Israeli identity card, Israeli citizenship. More and more Palestinians want to be Israeli citizens. And to answer your question, which alternatives do we have in the state of Israel? It is a national question. It is beyond security. It is beyond which party you support. Security is a must, and it has been attained. Even though we do have terror attacks, the current situation in terms of security is very different than it was before Operation Defensive Shield. And we know that we can do that because of the situation we've reached, because of the global understanding that it is our right and it is a prerogative to go into Area A where the Palestinians are in control, because we cannot leave our security up to the Palestinian security apparatuses. And Shaul, is this the most we can get to 20 years after Operation Defensive Shield, which when you were the head of the IDF? Is this the most we can do? It'll always be this way. Every so often, every few years or even less, there'll be a surge of terror, lone wolf terrorists, or maybe not lone wolves. Israel will defeat them, we'll have quiet for a few years, and then we'll have an operation in Gaza again, following another surge of terror? That's a great question. I talked about the public. Let's look at what happened to the leadership. After Arafat, we had Abu Mazen in power in 2005. He has been in power for the last 17 years, as head of the PA, head of the Fatah, and the president. And here, governments have changed, prime ministers have changed, at least 3 prime ministers we've had in this time frame. And in this equation, where are we headed? What's the future? Well, that's the role being played by the leadership. Palestinians have elected who they elected. And Abu Mazen, by the way, back in 2005, I was the Minister of Defense when he was elected, and he said, we want to stop the armed intifada. We are in favor of one authority, one law, and one weapon. Now, he's no Zionist. There's no, he's a Palestinian. He wants to take care of his people, but he is a weak leader. He is 87 years old, if I'm not mistaken, 87, even more, and he is being perceived as a weak leader by the Palestinians. And he has to face a terror organization, Hamas, and his last statement following the death of the journalist in Jenin is due to his weakness, because his status is weak among the Palestinians. Now, I don't see him as a partner for a peace agreement. It's not on the horizon, it's not on the cards. But what's happened in Israel is that we also have a political structure that I don't think will continue for long. I mean, I hope it does, but politically I don't think it's going to stay strong, and it's finding it very difficult to make long-term decisions. The only thing that is uniting the current coalition is that they don't want Netanyahu to be prime minister. There are 3 voices, and therefore here too, in terms of leadership on both sides, I don't see any maturity. There are people sitting here who are insightful, who are clever, sitting here in the first few rows. Certainly Amos will be able to talk about that. The alternatives are very, very limited. Either we go and be into peace talks, which I don't think will happen, or we'll continue dragging our heels in the current reality. But time is against us. This is not a good time for Israel. The security issues are not as bad as just dragging our heels, and then the problem will be that none of the founders of the State of Israel, certainly no one who has fought for it or led for it, would want this to happen, that we will have a binational state, and one day there'll be a Palestinian majority here or an Arab majority here instead of a Jewish one. But I am fearing this situation more than the worst days of the Intifada. We may be losing our national Jewish basis as the State of Israel. And therefore, I think it is time to make a decision. It's not tomorrow morning. It is right now in this generation. The current generation has to make this fateful decision. If we don't want to keep heading in this direction, if we don't want to go into yet another conflict with these two societies, the Israeli society versus the Palestinian one, then we must take our future into our own hands and say what we want ultimately, to decide our borders and to announce them, and to keep living our lives by allowing the Palestinians to also live their lives, but to leave things as they are now, that in any passing day, any passing minute is just going against us, that is not good for Israel. Amos. Yes, you can applaud Shaul, not the situation, unfortunately. Amos, I just wanted to ask you, first of all, I know that you share Shaul's view of things, and can you already describe the scene of this one-state solution, this binational state? You told me this week that it was a dead end. Yes, we're already there. In any university, you can take an exam twice, and we were wrong both times, and you can only take a third test if you were on reserve duty. And I want to explain. Arafat, I personally was a friend of his. It might sound strange to Shlomo. I was a friend, personal friend of Arafat. I visited him in Tunisia, I visited him in Gaza, in Cairo, I even flew on his airplane. But I wanted him dead. And by the way, in the Middle East, there's no contrast. There's no contradiction between the two. I mean, it's okay if you want to kill someone, even though you're his friend. And Arafat fooled us. The only one who listened to me when I said that was the Chief of General Staff, Mofaz, sitting here with us. He was the only one who listened to me. Everyone else, when I presented this to the political echelon, they said I was wrong, even though they let me talk for 47 minutes. And what was the mistake we made? He was an arch-terrorist who wanted to make peace, including the right of return. He was willing, Arafat, to compromise on between 250 and 400,000 refugees. And then we got to the second intifada, and if it weren't for Lieutenant General Reserves Shaul Mofaz, and he said, where did you get this information from? And we explained the intelligence, all the capabilities, and why did they pay the intelligence money if it shouldn't alert? I don't have an answer to that question to this day. The second thing is Abu Mazen. As Shaul has said, he is not a member of the Zionist movement, and I don't think he will be either. However, he is against terror. It's thanks to him that until now there has not been violence along the axes. That's what we want is the IDF to do. IDF has so many battalions as a result of Operation Defensive Shield, and with all the developments, there was quiet, and IDF was able to focus on the main threat, which is the strategy, which is Iran. Now we're already invested in it. So what did they invent? A genius invention. You can make peace without the Palestinians. Okay, perhaps you can. What do we care? What does Mohammed bin Zayed care about 1,300,000 people if we get stuck here with a community conflict? Now Abu Mazen coordinated us in terms of security, and he's not in favor of terrorism, and no one on the political echelon is talking to him. Everyone used to crawl on their hands and knees to Arafat. I don't want to give any plastic descriptions. He kissed me as well, and I told my wife by mistake, and that's just my personal mistakes. But with Abu Mazen, no one's even talking to the poor guy, except the head of the ISA, the Shabak, because he is in charge of combating terrorism. The Minister of Defense is the only one who does it, but only recently, because he understands. And it's those in the IDF who maybe should withdraw from him. They are the ones who are willing to talk to him because they realize that they are not a military force. Now, Abu Mazen, he thinks he's eternal. I personally think, as I say, he is mistaken. He's 87 years old and counting, and he will probably die soon. And I think that I personally estimate that he is closer to dying than he is to being born. And so when he will disappear, what is the heritage he's leaving behind? Because if it's Sinwar, then we speak to him through the Egyptians, and if he would accept us directly, we would go directly. And Sinwar is playing the same game we did. He doesn't want to cope with the IDF, and so he's saying, okay, they took away my tunnels, I'm not going to harm the communities around Gaza, let's light a religious fire, and the fire will come out of Jerusalem and it will burn Israel together with the Muslims. Does he see the fruit of his labor? Yes, in Operation Guardian of the Walls has begun a conflict between Israeli Arabs and Israeli Jews, and now Jerusalem can have fire coming out of it. So ultimately, hello and welcome. I don't want to speak too long because I want Sharon to speak longer, but I just want to say to you that there is a strategic mistake happening with the Palestinians, with the current leadership, the fact that we're not talking to them, and all those who are the heirs, and I know them each personally, they are just going to compete who is going to be more violent. Wait, Amos, and what's the most important thing is the one state. What do we want? Israel, we want it to be Jewish and democratic. That's the basis. Wait, Amos, I just want to hone what you just said. You're saying that after Abu Mazen, we won't have anyone to talk to? We really won't have a partner to speak to? Look, we asked MK Mansour Abbas to come here and tell you why. And you know why? Because he is a historical leader. I don't think there is such leadership anymore. It's like we said, the fever is broken. What does it mean that the fever is broken? If I have a thermometer and I break it, then the fever has broken. And if I turn on the air conditioning, it doesn't mean that the heat has disappeared. We cannot ignore the Palestinian issue. So I'm trying to understand the solution. The solution is, in history, well, Shlomo is sitting here and others who can teach me are sitting here, but in history there are two kinds of solutions. One is the one you initiate, and one is when you're passive in the situation, and the solution just happens. And we are becoming one entity, and that will have tremendous implications, and I think that we should beat this. And I think that, and I hope this continues, we have invited MK Mansour Abbas to salute him for his leadership, because I think it is rare bravery what he's doing. And that's it. I think that we are in reality, and I'm giving you the microphone back.
On the one hand, and you said there's no political feasibility to reach a conclusion now. We have to decide now. We have to decide on our boundaries. Can you make a decision now about the boundaries? Is it clear to you what our boundaries with the Palestinians should be? On a personal level, my answer is yes, but on a national level, I don't think that this government has any type of strategy about a future agreement with the Palestinians by definition. And each part of the current coalition believes in a different path and in a different outcome. As I said, that the time has come for a decision to be made. I meant our generation. Our generation must not leave the problem open for the next generations, for our grandchildren. Our children are serving in the army now, and I believe that over the last decades, I personally, in the country in general, had many conflicts, and the time has come to reach an agreement. If we can't reach an agreement between the two parties, the two sides, and Israel has to decide on its own boundaries and declare them, and to pass it in the state as a law. I don't think it's going to happen in this government, as I said before, because I don't think that it will be able to make any far-reaching decisions, and I would like to join with Mansour Abbas. I think that the good thing that happens with this government is that it has that side as well. It has an Arab party that is part of the government of Israel and supports the government and supports the state of Israel. I think that's an enormous achievement of the Israeli government and of Mansour Abbas personally. But without reaching a decision with this threat of a binational country. I think that the state of Israel may lose what we established here over the course of 74 years. Many people in the peace camp as well look at what's happening in Judea and Samaria, and they wonder what you mean when you say boundaries. Where will you draw the boundaries? If you look at the construction, the Jewish construction in Judea and Samaria, can you say that it's even practical to define boundaries there? The processes that the state of Israel has undergone, at least, especially in the last 20 years, since the Operation Protective Edge and the disengagement, one good thing has happened to Israel in the realization of the state of Israel. When we decided on the disengagement, and there are disagreements in the Israeli society about whether it was the right thing to do or not, and I completely supported that, and I thought that there was no reason for us to be there, even though I'm considered a hawk from that perspective. I believe that we had no security or national interests there. I think it was the right thing to do, but the big thing that happened as a result of the disengagement is that the world, and especially the United States and other Western countries, realized today, acknowledge the settlement blocks in Judea and Samaria, and there we have national and security interests. There we have to fight, and we have to remain in areas where there is an Israeli consensus. How does that coincide with the boundaries that you're talking about, withdrawing borders and disengaging from the Palestinians? At the time, I believed that the security barrier that we built, it was the result of a lot of thought. There may be cracks or holes in the wall, but they will be repaired. And it was very beneficial for Israeli security and for the Palestinian economy. So if there's a problem of people who have to come in, then we need more crossings, not more breaches in the wall. I believe that that recognition of the settlement blocks, and it's not by accident that in many places the security fence is near these blocks. I think that the majority of the Palestinian people will be willing to accept the large blocks. I'm not talking about the illegal or isolated settlements that can be brought into the larger blocks. This was part of the achievement of our broader campaign. The Palestinians that supported terror activity, supported Arafat, said, wait a minute, the Israelis know how to fight. They're not the same Israelis that pulled out of Lebanon as they see it and didn't want to fight anymore. The reserves showed up. 130%. They said, what do you mean? People came, people who were no longer doing army service. It was a moment of national resilience that the Jewish society accepted that when its blood is being shed, it fights and it is victorious. And when the achievement and the goal was achieved and the settlement blocks were recognized, it was time to make a decision. And pushing it off is causing harm to the future of the state of Israel. And I certainly hope that the leadership, that the next generation of leaders, and there are excellent people in our generation, and the next generation, they will be able to reach a decision. We have just a few seconds. We really have to end now, and I just want to ask, in conclusion, to close the Palestinian issue that we talked about in brief. I want to talk about the issue of the Gaza Strip. Assuming we're able to reach an agreement with Judea and Samaria and the PA, what do you do with the Gaza Strip? It's still there. Hamas, as it operates now under Sanawar, it says as follows. He wants incitement. He wants to offer everything. He wants to get rid of Abu Mazen. He wants to take over Judea and Samaria as well. He tried to assassinate him as well. And then they complained in Qatar. They ate dinner together and then came back. And then Qatar wished them all good luck. This is a very, very dangerous enemy. The way it speaks, maybe it will neutralize the ability to reach an agreement in Judea and Samaria as well. The fact that, what do? We say that let's keep them deterred and weakened. And what is that? What do we mean by that? What happens? They gain strength. If we talk to Hamas on the one hand and Abu Mazen differently, When I was the coordinator for activity in the occupied territories, I would meet with Abu Mazen all the time, even before he was elected, not because we were brothers, but because I thought it was important to have to maintain dialogue. What has to be done is to work with those who believe in a political solution and those who object to terrorism. If they support terrorism, then they'll join the Iranian ring that is growing tighter. And that is my summary of the review, of the detailed review that Shaul Mofaz was able to give us. And we're very fortunate that he was the Chief of General Staff during those terrible times. Thank you very much. And I hope we're successful. Thank you.